Hi, it's me again. I'm Kevin Horst, mental health specialist with the district. I really don't like presenting in this format just because it's so much fun to be in a room with people and kind of there's so much more energy and a much better vibe. However, the one good thing about presenting in this format is it made me change my shirt. I did the last one on de-escalation just about an hour ago. And I think this is like the third time I've changed my shirt since March just because I didn't want y'all thinking I only had one shirt. So I did find something good about presenting in this format. Um, the thing that we're going to be talking about, and again, when I say we, I mean me, is vicarious trauma. See if I can get this presenting. I think that does it. So the learning objectives is to develop an understanding of burnout, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion satisfaction, which is kind of the opposite of those first ones. Identify a number of risk areas or risk factors and protective factors that impact our tendency to experience secondary traumatic stress and impact the severity to which we would experience that. And then probably most importantly, identify tools for knowing whether or not we're experiencing it, preventing it, and doing something about it when it happens to us. So these are some indications that you may be experiencing secondary traumatic stress at your job. I think most people who've been in the workforce for any length of time have experienced some of these, and they may be maybe coming from secondary traumatic stress, but it could be just from burnout. I want to talk about the 1, 2, 3, fourth one down. I blame myself for not being able to help. I am incompetent. Through my career, I have supervised a lot of people, and many of the best ones would talk to me about how incompetent they feel. And when they say that, it surprises me in one sense, because many of those people are among the best workers that I have ever had the pleasure working with. And I am certain that their belief in their own incompetence doesn't come from their skill level or their commitment. It comes from the incredibly high demands and needs of the kids that they are working with. And they really want to get this done. They really want to help them, and they want to help them now. And when they aren't able to do that, they end up blaming themselves and feeling incompetent. And that is clearly an indication of secondary traumatic stress. I'm going to talk about primary trauma just a little bit. When I started with the district, one of the things that I was asked to do is help staff cope with secondary traumatic stress. And one of the things that I learned very quickly is that one of the things that we have to cope with is not only secondary stress or secondary trauma, excuse me, it's also primary trauma. And the difference is primary trauma occurs when you are subjected to a traumatic event. At school, those traumatic events can include you being verbally and or physically abused by students. And that happens fairly frequently. And it's a thing to obviously be aware of. And it's a thing that is somewhat related to secondary stress. However, it really does kind of deserve its own little place in the thing that we experience. So it's just some real quick stats related to secondary traumatic stress. And you can go through those. The only one I want to talk about is the second one. And that one is that 33% of teachers state they wish they had never entered the profession. I believe that statistic comes from all teachers, including general education teachers. And I would bet a lot that rate is higher with teachers who work in special education, because there is a special and an additional level of demand and difficulty that accompanies working with kids in special education, because their needs, kind of by definition, is so much greater. So burnout is a process that involves gradual exposure to job strain. And it really is generally related to the job tasks that are delineated in the job description. So if you have to do the same thing over and over again, or if you have a high stress job because you have a lot of deadlines and demands and things like that, that's the kind of a thing that can lead to job burnout. It's, I believe, most typically related to exhaustion and tiredness, both emotionally and physically, and can obviously impact one's motivation. Vicarious trauma, which is often used interchangeably with secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, is a process that occurs um, in us because we experience the pain and horror and trauma that students um, show and talk to us about. So the process is we get to know these kids. We end up caring about them a lot, and sometimes just loving them. And when we experience the pain that they experience every day, that takes a toll on us. And um, um, it mirrors post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm guessing that most of you are somewhat familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the thing that's the mental illness that occurs when people experience um, a singular traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, and it impacts them in just kind of all sorts of ways. It impacts their functioning across all spheres. There's some distinguishing characteristic between vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. I don't know that it's all that important, but one difference that's talked about sometimes is that um, um, vicarious trauma develops over time, where secondary traumatic stress can occur much more quickly. Again, STS is nearly identical to post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, like intrusive imagery, avoidance of a situation, hyperarousal, distressing emotion, cognitive changes, and functional impairment. I want to break those down a little bit. The intrusive imagery might include flashbacks. And this particularly, it can be a difficulty with staff, people who have experienced their own trauma. And if they hear a student talk about a traumatic event that mirrors one that they have, they may end up reliving that situation. I have found myself avoiding certain kids because they are in so much pain, I just ain't got it to give that day. And I think I've gotten much better at recognizing when I'm doing that. And there are some days where I say, okay, you got to go do this. You got to go lean in. You got to go do this. And then there are other days when I really recognize that I just don't have it. And I take off or I put it off for a little while. And I think both of those things are okay. There are times when I have just not had it to give, and I really do think it's okay to kind of give oneself a break at those moments. And then go back to it. But if you find yourself doing that consistently, then it's really, really important. Then you take some steps to deal with it in a different way, because obviously then you're not able to do your job and not able to provide the care to students that you really want to. Emotional indicators of post-traumatic stress disorder can include being indecisive. There are situations where you just don't feel like you know what to do because you end up overthinking things. And post-traumatic stress disorder and STS can impair our ability to think creatively. Oftentimes, another emotional indicator is an inability to relax or unwind because the job is always on our mind, and we can't escape from the feelings of sadness or depression or anger or anxiety that we experience that's coming directly from the kid's trauma. Being easily irritated, feeling unworthy, feeling depressed, mood swings, giving up hope for change in the students are all additional emotional indicators. Behavioral indicators, I already talked about one of those, and one of those was withdrawal. Working harder and getting less done, excessive things like smoking, alcohol, gambling, escaping, all of those things just that can be unhealthy ways to kind of take your mind off the job. Physical indicators can include things like headaches, stomach aches, inability to sleep, weight loss, appetite change, decreased interest in sex, and just feeling tired and run down all of the time. I said this earlier, compassion fatigue is also used synonymously with vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. I did go to one workshop one time where they talked about it as something different. And I have experienced this. And to me, it felt different than STS. And that was a different level of giving up and a different level of kind of questioning the value of what I was doing. I am really, really committed. I love this job. I'm fortunate to have this job. I really like working with both the staff and the kids, and there have been times where it really has felt pointless. And when I felt that, it was really an indication that I had to do something differently. Compassion fatigue has also been associated with questioning the existence of a higher power, even for people who are highly spiritual or highly religious. I talked to one staff person one time who was a very, very religious person. And one of the things that they said was, this work has made me question a belief that there is a God. Because if there is a God, how in the hell can he or she allow kids to experience what they're experiencing? I wish I had an answer for that. Everyone that works with individuals with a history of trauma is vulnerable to developing secondary traumatic stress. And in some ways, that's really good. And in some ways, that's not so good. The good part about that is that when people experience secondary traumatic stress, it does mean that they are open to attachment with kids. And it's only when we are open to attachment with kids that we have the ability to form the kind of relationships with them that are necessary for them to take healthy risks. So that the thing I talked about in the last session, it becomes a difficulty when we're not able to put limits on that attachment, and that we take on their feelings and take on their trauma. But a certain level of secondary traumatic stress from time to time, I actually think is probably kind of a good indication that people are really, really invested in their jobs. It is very important that people who experience that, or when they experience that, have some mechanisms with which to cope. So personal risk factors. So these are the things that can make secondary traumatic stress more likely or a bigger deal. Age. This is a really interesting one because I believe that age with regard to secondary traumatic stress can go either way. Being older and being in this for a long time, I've had the ability to experience a lot of things, and it would be I always tell myself this, I think I've seen it all. And then, of course, as soon as I say that, something else comes along. And that really reminds me of one of the best lines my brother-in-law ever had. We were doing something one night, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but we were trying to do this thing where it would work out really well, and his kids couldn't screw it up. And I said, I think we got it. I think we got this thing idiot proof. And he looks at me and he goes, as soon as we make it idiot proof, they will build a better idiot. And I think that kind of fits here because while I believe that I have experienced it all, at another level, I'm sure I haven't. Trying to get back to the point at this point, if that's even possible. So there are some advantages to being older and having a level of experience. There are also some advantages to being younger because I think I get worn out quicker than many of some of the younger, kind of more energetic staff. A very, very important personal risk factor is a person's experience of abuse or trauma. And I mentioned this earlier. If people have experienced their own trauma and they hear or know about a child who have experienced a similar thing, the likelihood that they will experience secondary traumatic stress behind that is greatly increased. And the difficulty with PTSD is that people aren't able to remember it and experience without reliving it. And so if a child talks to a staff person who has been sexually abused about their own sexual abuse, there's a higher likelihood that that staff person will re-feel the feelings that they had when they were sexually abused. And that can obviously be a very, very difficult situation. Gender can be a personal risk factor. And in some ways, I'm not really sure which gender might be more or less susceptible to STS. I think it really depends upon the individual. I think there are some, just given our society, there are some men who are able to let some things roll off their back a little bit easier because our society has, to some degree, trained men to close off from their feelings. And that can be an advantage. And conversely, women in our society are generally perceived as being more nurturing than compared to men. And I know that that's a generalization, and I know that that does not hold up for every individual, but it really is kind of one of our societal things. And so gender in that way can make a difference. If we have unrealistic expectations of the students that we work with, that can increase our experience of STS. If we want things to happen too quickly and aren't able to recognize that the difficulties that our students have are years in the making and it's going to take a really long time for them to get better, we're going to have unrealistic expectations and end up feeling that we're incompetent or not being valuable. Another risk factor is when situations conflict with our ethics and values. I had a supervisee one time quit very, very quickly after a short period of time because they were raised in a very religious household, and they were taught that it's really, really not okay to talk back to adults. And when this staff person experienced kids not only talking back to adults, but being verbally abusive and calling really, really bad names, including the MF names and the C name, that was a thing that they just could not take and got out of there in a hurry. Another risk factor is wanting to show positive emotions and wanting others to show positive emotions, because there are lots of times where that's just not possible for the kids that we work with. Another risk factor is when we're not prepared, when we're not ready, either cognitively or mentally or emotionally to do this job. If we get caught on an off day where our energy level is down or we're just not there, that can increase the likelihood that we're going to experience STS and experience to a higher degree. Protective factors. These are the things that kind of protect us from STS. And one of those is age, and it's just the converse of the things that I said before. And again, it's related to level of experience. Spirituality can also be very strong protective factors. Protective factors. People who have a high degree of spirituality and a feeling of a connection with a higher power oftentimes have the ability to recognize that things are out of their control. And, some of the phrases that might go along with that might be something like, I'm just going to let go and let God on this one, and I'm just going to trust in the outcome. And this is part of God's plan, and I don't understand it, but I'm just going to roll with it and do the best that I can. And that can be comforting to individuals. Creativity is another one, and creativity is oftentimes a casualty of STS because STS impairs our ability to think, especially creatively. But if we can stay creative, we can think of different ways to intervene with kids and kind of get them on track and feeling better about themselves. And it can also help us creatively come up with ways that we can deal with our own STS. Knowledge of STS is an important protective factor. It's one thing when we experience STS, it's totally, and know what it is. It's really another thing when we experience STS and we don't know what the heck hit us. The first time that I was aware that I was experiencing secondary traumatic stress was when I was working in a day treatment program over in Minneapolis. I lived about 1.5 miles away, and I was driving home along, I can't remember if it's Portland or Park. I think it's Park, the one that's one way to the south. I was listening to a McDonald's commercial, and the theme of the McDonald's commercial was this family going out after a soccer game or baseball game or something like that. And again, then this happened in the 70s, probably before most of you were born. Stop laughing at me. Yes, McDonald's was a thing at that time. So I'm driving down the road, I'm listening to this commercial on the radio, and all of a sudden I'm crying. And I did not know what hit me. And I'm just thinking, what the F is this? And a little while after I got home, I figured it out. I had just left a family session with this family that I really, really loved. And they were amazingly impoverished. It was a mom with 3 kids. And she cared about her kids as much as any person cared about anybody that I have ever met. And she just did not have the resources to give her kids the things that she wanted to give her kids. And the McDonald's commercial was the thing that triggered that. And it was in some ways, a relief to figure out that's what was going on with me. Because before I figured out the relationship between the McDonald's commercial and that family session, I was thinking, I'm losing my mind. But after I figured that out, I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense. This sucks, but it makes sense. So in that way, knowledge of STS, what it does to us, and what we can do to help ourselves when we experience it is a strong protective factor. Compassion satisfaction is a protective factor that involves us feeling like we're doing what we were put on this earth to do. So when we're in our job and we're doing a good job and we're kind of connecting with kids, and even though it's very, very difficult, we're able to hang on to the fact that we're doing the best we can and we are being helpful. That can help ward off STS. Preparation, I did that one just on the bad factors. So I won't do that again. Support network is a strong protective factor. If we have other people to rely on, both in our personal life and in our professional life, having that sort of social support network can give us people to kind of talk about it or share experiences with, and kind of do fun things with, and that can protect us from STS. Maintaining strong set of personal norms is somewhat connected to compassion, satisfaction in that we're seeing things happen, and we're feeling good about it, and we're able to recognize the things that we are providing for kids. Self-awareness is really related to the knowledge of STS. When we have a high degree of self-awareness, we're able to recognize when this is happening to us, and we're able to intervene and do something about it, and we're able to put a label on it. And once we can say, oh yeah, this is STS, that's a very, very different thing than going through that experience and not knowing what the heck it is. I'll talk about a self-care plan in subsequent slides. Optimistic outlook. There are some people who are just the black Labrador puppies of the human world. Lots of dogs, and I always think about black labs. They are just genetically cheerful, and things can be going horribly wrong for them. They can be on a really I saw this happen. My son's dog was on a real slippery staircase, tumbled down the stairs, got to the bottom, looked up, and seemed all happy about it, like, okay, that was cool, now what's next? And there are some people who just have this genetically cheerful outlook, who are less likely to kind of be dragged down by those kinds of things. I'll talk about one thing that we can do to kind of improve the likelihood that we can maintain an optimistic outlook. And that last one, having a chance to express feelings, is really related to the social support network. It's not that easy, that I talked about in the previous slide. It's important that an organization helps provide protective factors to staff, especially in a place like 916. And I really do believe that 916 does a good job in providing resources for staff. Some of it is compensation. There are some job descriptions within 916 that are paid more than the same job description in other school districts. The supervisors that I know do their darndest to provide a supportive and reflective supervision process to help people recognize and cope with STS. Staff empowerment can be important, because when people feel powerless, they feel less able to have an impact on their lives. Strong agency training. That's what we're doing right now. And if I'm doing a good job, and Lord knows I hope I am, I'm hoping that this can be a protective factor against people developing too much STS. Clear organizational structure, and having clearly defined roles so that people know what is expected of them is a protective factor. Support for supervisors, regular association and recognition of staff is important. I think staff people are encouraged to spend time together and have some downtime together, and to form a supportive peer group that can help them with secondary traumatic stress, and both in terms of just kind of blowing off some steam and just sharing feelings in a more informal way. Trauma-informed practices is also a really big one, because, and I think Kara talked about those. When we recognize where some of the behaviors that we experience from kids are coming from, that gives us a little bit different way to think about it, and makes it a little bit easier for us to understand it, and kind of roll with it and have it impact us a little bit less. Compassion satisfaction is a sense of fulfillment that we experience when we make a difference. And I said this before, when we're doing what we believe that we've been put on this earth to do. And sometimes this job, even on the tough days, if we think about it in the long term, and we have a long game in mind. Even though kids have a really, really tough day and it doesn't seem like they're going anywhere, hanging on to the belief that things will get better and it just takes time can be very, very life-giving. Really wish I could describe the high number of kids that I've worked with over the years that at one point I thought, oh my God, the prognosis for them is really, really rough. This poor guy or gal doesn't have a chance. And 1 or 2 or 3 years later, or even 5 or 6 or 7 years later, you find out that things have turned out really, really well. And I totally believe it's because the care, at least in large part, because of the care they got at 916 schools. There was one student who I had not had contact with in 4 years who called me this was probably about 8 months ago. And one of my favorite kids, moderate level of autism. When I first met him, he was non-functional. He could not be in a classroom for more than 10 minutes without kind of getting out of there because of the level of his anxiety. When I talked to him about, I think it was 7 or 8 months ago, told me that he'd been working at Costco making a lot of money, and he had been there for over 3 years and was really getting good reviews from his supervisors. And no one would have seen that coming. Oh, and the reason he called was 2 things. One was he wanted the name of the therapist who he could go see because he was kind of having some struggles with depression. And the other was just to thank me and to ask me to thank some other folks that he worked with while he was at 916. Resilience being the capacity for people to overcome quickly from difficulties. And there are some people who are very, very resilient, and there are some people who have difficulty with that. The previous slides on protective factors is very related, is related to that. Relationship is a huge part of resilience. And when we have other people that we can lean on and depend on, our ability to be resilient is increased. So what can I do? One bite at a time. I've spent a little bit more time on that. Recognize the small things. Kids make changes in small increments, and when we can recognize that and recognize one time that they didn't blow up quite so big, or they showed a social skill that we were working on with them for a while, and they demonstrate that. And if we can recognize those small steps that eventually lead to huge gains, that can help us. Again, this takes time, and it is a slow process. This is one that you may want to pause and enlarge, but this is a self-care wheel. I mean, it just talks about the different spheres that we all have, like psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, professional, and physical, and the different ways that we can address our own needs in those different spheres. Other things we can do. Now, these are just things that we can do to kind of help ourselves feel better and decrease the impact of secondary traumatic stress. I've never journaled in my entire life. I never will. And there are other people that find great comfort in doing that. Cognitive restructuring. I'm going to talk about that in I think it's 2 slides down. Might be the next slide. Take time off. When we are experiencing secondary traumatic stress, one of the things that sometimes happen is we believe that we can't take any time off because, oh my God, what will happen to the kids? Kids are going to be okay. It's important that we do take some time off. And if you feel like you can't take some time off, it's really time to adjust that thought. Because if you have that one, and you feel like you really can't take any time off, there's a high likelihood that you're going to take that out on the kids in some indirect way. Having healthy habits. And those are in that previous kind of self-care wheel. Talking with friends and family, spending time in nature, getting outside can really be helpful. Strengthening your spirituality, learning about STS, I talked about that already. Having a personal care plan for coping with stress. And that's one of those things that you can do to kind of get out in front of it and plan that prior to the time that you are experiencing STSS, or I'm sorry, STS. There's this thing called MTSS that we use a lot in schools, and I'm sure if you don't know about it yet, you will. And I keep getting mixed up with that one. So take breaks, relax, work on your own breathing. There was that video from the previous de-escalation one about kids breathing, and it works with kids and it works with us. In many ways, we are just like them. Not only learn to say no, but feel comfortable saying no when you just ain't got it together. I mentioned that earlier. There are times when I just didn't have it. And it's helpful to be able to give oneself permission to do that. Avoid the excesses. Talked about that one already. Professional therapy sometimes is helpful. Fidgets, toys and games, and that can obviously occur with friends. And there's another set of people, and I'm one of them, who need a lot of time alone. And sometimes people get a lot of energy from other people, and sometimes when they're kind of at the end of their rope, they do better when they have some time alone. Be there for each other. Maintain a social connectedness outside of work. Don't do that with people who you find bring you down. There are some people who I really, really like to hang out with outside of work. A little bit, not a lot, but some. Like go to a bar after work. And then there have been other people in my career where I've really, really had to avoid because for me, they just made things worse. And it's really important that we recognize those and don't try to take care of those people. Take care of yourself. Hobbies and interests, talked about that. Accept that good enough is good enough. We can't do everything that we want to do that quickly. And it's important that we allow ourselves to be imperfect. Don't do volunteer work that's very, very much like the work that you do at 916, unless you find it really energizing. I think I covered the ones after that sufficiently. We're going to talk a little bit more about this one. So cognitive approaches. So this is the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy. And it just shows the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We have much more control over our thoughts than we do our feelings. And our thoughts have a great influence over our feelings. My favorite example of this has to do with a little girl, 4-year-old girl, was at home with her dad. Her dad was a guy that I worked with, and he told her story. He was cooking pasta. She was in the kitchen. She started heading over toward the stove and started reaching up toward the pot of boiling water, and he screamed, "Tina!" Tina wasn't her name. And Tina looked at him, started to cry, and ran to her room and closed the door. And so if you break that down, what happened there was the behavior was Tina was headed toward the stove. Her dad yelled at her to protect her, but her thought was not that my dad's trying to protect me. She thought that she did something wrong. And so the feelings that followed her belief that she did something wrong were probably shame, sadness, maybe fear. And then her behavior behind that was running to her room and slamming the door. If Maya correctly interpreted that situation, her thought would have been, oh, my dad just saved me from a lifetime of disfigurement. I think I'll go give him a hug. Or no, I'm sorry. He just saved me. The feeling would be one of love. I love him. And the behavior would be, I'm going to go give him a hug. We can work really hard at managing our thoughts. And so this is a really stark example, but I believe it'll show the point. If we believe that we get called a name by a kid because we are in fact older than dirt or ugly as F or something like that, then our feeling behind that is going to be anger and resentment, and the behavior behind that is more likely going to be kind of some sort of unhealthy or unhelpful response. If we can recognize that sort of behavior is a function of the person's trauma, and even have some empathy behind the pain that led them to make those kinds of statements, our feelings are going to be very, very different, and our behavior can be much more accepting. I'm not saying that they should not be held responsible for that behavior and helped to avoid that behavior. But our interventions can be more trauma informed and not punitive. And so working on our thoughts and recognizing when we're having thoughts that might be unproductive and changing those thoughts to more productive ones can be very, very helpful. Hope. Every time I see that, I think of Shawshank Redemption, where kind of toward the end of it, the guy who gets away talks about how hope is maybe the best thing. And in some ways it may be. So a belief that things will get better and the future will get better, and a recognition that things take time, can be very helpful to us. Everything worthwhile has its obstacles, and they can be overcome. Hope and resilience can help us bounce back from very, very difficult times, and helps us it helps empower us. Believing that there is hope and believing that we can do something about it helps motivate us to keep on trying. Recognition that this is a process is very, very important. If we have mastery goals, the one on the right, and those goals relate to getting things done and having it done at a certain timetable, those kinds of goals can lead us to feeling like we're a failure. Learning goals and recognizing that this is a process, and that while the kids are learning, we are also learning ways to do this better, and that's okay. We don't have to have all the answers right now. That can help us be resilient and hang on to some really positive energy. So these next few slides, I'm not going to go through these. These are just resources. So if you would like to kind of take a look at some other resources and things that may be helpful in coping with secondary traumatic stress, that's the way to do it. I also have office hours, and that's the reason. And so if it does get to the point where you really want to talk to somebody about that, and you would like to talk to me about that, you can email me. You could also, on all of the emails that I send, I have a link to those office hours. And and there's also a link to those office hours on the staff pages. Thank you. I said this last time, but I want to end with it also. Welcome to 916. I really, really hope that this experience is as fulfilling for you as it has been for me. Okay, now I got to figure out how to turn this thing off.